The road had no name that Wren Calloway had ever learned, though she had walked it in her mind for years before her feet found it in truth. Mist curled low over the grass on either side, silver and unhurried, and somewhere ahead, always ahead, as it had been for as long as she could remember, a chime sounded. 3 notes, soft as a held breath, rising and falling like something settling gently into sleep. She had heard it first as a child, in the pause between waking and dreaming. She had heard it in the small hours of harder years, when sleep wouldn't come, and the ceiling above her bed felt too close and too watchful. She had never once seen where it came from. Tonight, for reasons she could not have explained to anyone who asked, she had simply followed it out of her own front door and kept walking until the road became unfamiliar and the mist became a kind of quiet company. Though the chime came again, closer now, and with it came the tower. It rose out of the fog rather than appearing in it, the way a held breath finally lets go gray stone climbing higher than seemed reasonable. Its highest window lit gold against a sky gone the soft color of a bruise healing, deep blue easing toward a morning that would not. She somehow understood arrive in any hurry. The tower did not loom over the road. It simply stood the way old and patient things stand, waiting to be noticed rather than announcing itself to the night. Wren's steps slowed without her deciding they should. Her shoulders, which she had carried high and tight for longer than she could easily remember, ached in the particular way that meant she had forgotten again to let them rest. Her eyes stung faintly, not from tears, but from the specific specific tiredness of someone who has been awake in one way or another for a very long time. At the base of the tower stood a gate of dark, unrusted brass, and beside the gate stood a man. He was neither young nor old in any way she could easily pin down, the kind of face that seemed to have settled into its kindness decades ago and simply stayed there since. He wore a long coat the color of tea gone dark in a good pot, and around his neck, on a thin chain, hung a small brass watch. As Wren approached, he lifted the watch between two fingers, wound it once with a slow, unhurried turn, and held it briefly to his ear. It ticked exactly once, and he tucked it back beneath his collar, as though satisfied by something quietly private. "You found the sound, then," he said. His voice moved slowly, the way water moves over old stone that has long since stopped minding the water. Most people do eventually, if they let themselves. Some take longer than others. There's no shame in either. I didn't know I was looking for anything, Wren admitted. I just followed it. That's usually how it goes in my experience. He studied her for a moment, not with the sharpness of assessment, but with the soft attention of someone noticing kindly that she was tired in a way sleep alone hadn't fixed in a long while. "My name is Aurelio. I keep this tower such as it needs keeping. It doesn't need very much, truthfully." "Wren," she said. "Wren Calloway. Wren." He said her name the way one might set down something fragile carefully, checking first that the surface beneath it was steady and would hold. "Come in, then, if you'd like. The night's not going anywhere fast, and neither, I think, are you. He didn't wait for her answer before turning toward the gate. But he didn't rush ahead of her either. He simply moved at a pace that assumed she would follow when she was ready, and not one moment before. The brass gate swung open without a sound, as though it had been oiled by decades of exactly this kind of quiet arrival, over and over, always gently. Beyond it, warm light spilled out onto the worn stone step, amber and low, the color of a lamp turned down for reading rather than working. Wren felt the warmth reach her before she reached it, a gentle heat against her face, like the memory of a fire from a house she'd lived in long ago and had almost forgotten she missed. She looked up once more at the tower, at the single lit window far above, and at the dark shape of the roofline beyond it, where she was almost certain, though the mist made it hard to be entirely sure. A very faint golden haze seemed to breathe in and out, slow as something sleeping soundly. The three-note chime sounded once more, gentler this time, as if it too had noticed she was closer now and no longer needed to call so loudly to be heard. Was that the tower? She asked. Aurelio glanced back over his shoulder, and something in his expression suggested he'd been asked this same question before by other tired travelers on other misty nights, not so different from this one. The tower has its own way of saying hello, he said. It's very glad you came, Wren. It doesn't often say so twice in one evening. I'd take that as something worth noting. Wren didn't fully understand what he meant, and and she found, standing there in the gold spill of light with the cold mist still clinging faintly to her coat, that she didn't need to understand just yet. That could come later, slowly, or not at all. For now, there was only the warmth ahead of her, and the tiredness settled deep in her shoulders, and the quiet, steady certainty new to her and entirely welcome that she had at long last arrived somewhere she was allowed to stop. She stepped through the gate. Inside, the tower was warmer than Wren had expected, and quieter than seemed possible for a building so full of moving parts. A spiral staircase of dark wood climbed away from the entry hall, wrapped in a soft rope of lamplight that seemed to glow from no single source, but simply hung in the air at intervals, like fireflies that had agreed to stay still. The walls on either side were lined, floor to ceiling, with the workings of clocks, brass gears the size of dinner plates, turning so slowly that Wren had to watch for several seconds before she trusted her own eyes that they moved at all. They keep their own time up here, Aurelio said, noticing her gaze. Slower than the time you're used to. It took me some years to stop finding that strange. How long have you kept this place? Long enough that the question doesn't quite mean what it used to. He said it without weight, the way one might mention the weather, and began climbing the stairs at an unhurried pace, one hand trailing along the banister as though greeting it, long enough to know that nobody arrives here who didn't need to. Wren followed, her hand finding the banister too. It was warm beneath her palm, warmer than wood left in a cool stairwell had any right to be, and faintly she could feel it humming, not vibrating exactly, but humming the way a held note hums after the string has stopped being plucked. The sound of the tower revealed itself slowly as they climbed. At first, she thought it was silence, the particular hush of old stone. Then she began to notice it wasn't silence at all, but hundreds, perhaps thousands, of small sounds layered so gently atop one another that they blurred into something like the hush of rain on a roof. Ticking, not one clock's ticking, but many, each at its own soft tempo, some quick as a resting heartbeat, some so slow she wondered if they were ticking at all or simply breathing. There are so many of them, she said. There are. Aurelio paused to adjust a small brass fitting on the wall. A motion so brief it seemed more habit than necessity. Every clock here keeps a different hour in its way. None of them are wrong. They're just differently right, if that makes sense. Not entirely, Wren admitted. And something in her own honesty made her smile, small and unguarded, for the first time in what felt like a long while. It will, he said, or it won't. And that will be all right too. He continued up, and his sentence trailed into a low, wordless hum that seemed to carry itself up the stairwell ahead of him, blending with the ticking until Wren couldn't tell where his voice ended and the tower's sound began. They passed a landing with a round window, glass thick and faintly warped with age. Looking out over a hillside gone soft with fog. The moon hung low and generous above it, more silver than white, its light pooling on the mist below like something poured rather than merely shining. Wren paused there without meaning to, one hand against the cool glass, and felt for a moment entirely and strangely at peace. You can stop as long as you like at any window, Aurelio said, not turning around, as though he'd known she would need telling this eventually. Nothing in this tower minds waiting for you. Is that a rule? It's more of a habit the tower's gotten into. He resumed climbing, unbothered by her delay, and she found herself grateful for it in a way she didn't examine too closely. Rules imply someone might break them. Nothing here is in enough of a hurry to break anything. Further up, the gears along the walls grew larger, their brass darker with touch, some etched faintly with markings Wren didn't recognize as numbers or letters. More like the pattern water leaves on stone after years of the same gentle current. She trailed her fingers along one and felt the faintest tremor of movement beneath her touch. "What are they for?" she asked. "All of them. Some keep the tower standing," Aurelio said. "Some keep the hours honest for those who still need honest hours. And some," he paused, just slightly, the way a person pauses before setting down something they've carried carefully for a long way, keep other things, quieter things. You'll see if you'd like to, though there's no need to see everything tonight. Wren wanted to ask what he meant by quieter things, but something about the unhurried warmth of the stairwell and the low gold light and the endless soft ticking all around her made the question feel like it could wait. it would still be there tomorrow, whatever tomorrow meant, inside a tower that kept its own slow time. For now, climbing beside a man who never once looked back to check that she was keeping pace, she found she trusted that everything worth knowing would arrive exactly when it was ready to. They reached a wide landing where the staircase forked gently to either side, and Aurelio slowed further still, as if the tower itself had asked him to. He glanced toward the left-hand passage, then the right, the way someone might glance at two old friends before choosing which to visit first, and seemed satisfied by whatever quiet answer he received. This part of the climb confuses most people, he said, not because it's difficult, because there's no wrong way to go, and most people aren't used to that. Which way are we going? Wherever your feet decide, once they've rested a moment. He nodded toward a low bench set into an alcove in the stone, cushioned in fabric the color of dried lavender, worn soft by years of exactly this kind of pause. Sit if you'd like. The stairs aren't going anywhere, and neither, as I said, are you. Wren sat gratefully and found the bench held the same faint warmth as the banister, as though the tower had decided long ago to be kind to whoever climbed it. From here, she could see down through the stairwell's open center, where lamplight pooled and drifted lazily upward like something poured in reverse. Aurelio stood nearby without hovering, his watch chain catching the light each time he shifted his weight, and said nothing further, as though some silences were meant to be sat in rather than filled. Almost there, he said eventually, and hummed the rest of the sentence into the waiting dark. The passage they finally chose curved gently to the right, opening after a few more steps into a small round room tucked into the curve of the tower like a pocket sewn into the lining of a coat. A window seat filled the far wall, deep and cushioned, angled toward a round window whose glass held the moonlight the way a cupped hand holds water. A quilt lay folded at one end, the color of the inside of a seashell, and beside it sat a brass lamp turned low, casting its light in a soft circle that didn't quite reach the corners of the room, as though the room preferred to keep a little dimness for itself. This is where you'll rest, if you'd like, Aurelio said, setting a hand briefly on the door frame, as though introducing the room properly. It isn't assigned to you. It simply seemed tonight like the room that had been waiting. Wren stepped inside and felt something in her chest loosen slightly, the way a held knot gives an inch before it fully releases. On the small table beside the window seat sat a cup, and beside the cup a pot, both faintly warm, steam curling from the spout in a thin, unhurried ribbon. Though she hadn't asked for tea and hadn't seen anyone bring it. I didn't, she began. No, Aurelio agreed before she could finish. You didn't ask. The tower tends to notice what a person needs before they've found the words for it. It isn't magic, exactly. Or perhaps it is. I've never found much use in drawing that line too firmly. Wren sat on the edge of the window seat, And the moment her weight settled into the cushions, she felt the last of the evening's walking drain slowly out of her legs. Her shoulders, still faintly stiff, softened by degrees as she poured the tea and held the warm cup between both palms. Outside the round window, the fog had thinned enough to show the hillside properly now, silvered and still, the moon sitting low and unbothered above it, like something that had also decided long ago to stop hurrying anywhere. Oh, you keep saying the tower does things, she said. Notices things. Is it alive in some way? Aurelio considered this with the unhurried care of a man deciding how to fold a letter rather than simply tear it open. It's aware in its own fashion, he said. The way an old garden is aware of which plants need water before they wilt, or the way a well-loved house creaks differently for a stranger than for someone it knows. I wouldn't call it alive the way you or I are alive, but it isn't nothing either. And you, have you always kept it? Long enough that the answers stopped mattering much, even to me. He said this without sadness, the way one might mention an old scar that no longer aches. I wind a watch every evening that I don't need to wind, and I listen to it tick once, and then I go on with whatever the evening asks of me. That's most of what keeping this tower means in practice. Small rituals, small kindnesses. The rest tends to take care of itself. Wren sipped the tea, which tasted faintly of honey and something floral she couldn't name, and felt her eyelids grow heavy in a way that wasn't unwelcome. Beneath the room's quiet, she became aware again of that layered hush of ticking she'd noticed on the stairs, softer here, muffled by distance, but present all the same. And beneath even that, fainter still, something that might have been a deeper hush, a stillness with its own particular shape, coming from somewhere further down in the tower. "What's that sound?" she asked. "Underneath the ticking, it's different." Aurelio's gaze flicked, just briefly, toward the floor, in the direction of whatever lay beneath them. "There's a room lower down where the tower keeps things that have finished ticking," he said carefully. "Quieter things, as I mentioned on the stairs. You're welcome to see it if you're curious, whenever you're ready. Tonight, though, I'd suggest only resting. That room isn't going anywhere either. Tomorrow, then," Wren said, though the word felt strange in her mouth, uncertain whether tomorrow meant anything at all inside walls that kept their own slow time. Tomorrow, or whenever tomorrow decides to arrive, Aurelio agreed, and something in his tone suggested he found the uncertainty entirely reasonable. He moved toward the door, pausing once more with his hand on the frame. "Sleep well, Wren Calloway. The tower's glad to have you resting under its roof tonight." He left the door open a small width, neither shut nor wide, and his footsteps faded down the curved passage, unhurried, humming faintly as he went. Wren finished her tea, set the cup aside, and drew the quilt over her legs, still watching the moon through the round window. Her eyes drifted shut, then opened again, not from discomfort, but from a small, persistent curiosity that hadn't quite finished asking its questions. She thought of the deeper hush beneath the floor, of whatever quiet things waited there, finished with their ticking. whatever it was, she decided drowsily it could wait until she was ready to meet it. Somewhere in the drifting space between waking and sleep, she thought she heard the chime again. The same 3 notes that had drawn her out of her own front door, though softer now, closer, as though it no longer needed to travel so far to reach her. It didn't startle her the way it once might have. It felt instead like a small hand resting briefly against her own. A reminder that whatever had called her here all these years wasn't finished with its quiet work just yet, and didn't intend to rush the rest. The lamp beside her dimmed itself gradually, so slowly she couldn't have named the moment it changed, until the room held only moonlight and the faint amber afterglow of a wick that hadn't quite gone out. The quilt was warm across her legs, warmer than the room itself seemed to be, as though it had been waiting, folded for exactly this night and exactly this tiredness. Beneath the floor, that deeper hush persisted, patient and unhurried, neither calling to her nor asking to be ignored, simply present, the way a door left slightly open is present, without demanding to be walked through. The sleep came for her slowly, gently, the way the tide comes for a shoreline that has long since stopped minding the water. Wren woke to a light that seemed neither morning nor evening. A soft gray gold hush filtering through the round window, the kind of light that might belong to any hour a tired person needed it to be. Her body felt different than it had in longer than she cared to count. Loose in the shoulders, easy in the breath, particular heaviness of true rest sitting pleasantly behind her eyes, rather than the usual heaviness of not having rested at all. The tea things had been cleared away without her noticing, and in their place sat a small folded note written in a careful, unhurried hand. Wander as you like. Nothing minds. Find me when you're ready, or don't, and I'll find you instead. She smiled at that, dressed slowly, and stepped out into the curved passage where the tower's endless soft ticking greeted her like something almost familiar now, a texture rather than a sound. She had no destination in mind, only the loose, unfamiliar freedom of a morning, or whatever this was, with nowhere she needed to be. The passage led her past small windows shaped like gears, their glass cut into wedges that scattered the gray-gold light into soft, fractured patterns across the stone floor. She trailed her fingers along a catwalk railing, brass worn smooth and warm beneath years, decades, perhaps longer, of other hands doing exactly the same thing. Somewhere below, she could hear the low turning of some great mechanism, patient and unbothered, keeping whatever hour it alone understood. She passed a room where small clockwork birds sat motionless on a shelf, wings folded, waiting for some cue she couldn't guess at. She passed another where a wall of tiny drawers, each no larger than a matchbox, held. She peered briefly into one left ajar, a scattering of dried flower petals, faded gently to the color of old paper. In a third room, wider than the rest, dozens of pendulums hung from a ceiling too high to see clearly, swinging in long, lazy arcs that never quite synchronized, so that the room seemed to breathe in overlapping rhythms, like a small crowd of sleepers dreaming at slightly different speeds. She lingered there longer than she meant to, watching one particular pendulum, brass gone soft green with age, sweep back and forth in a slow, hypnotic line. It cast a thin shadow across the floor that lengthened and shortened as it moved, and something about the sight loosened a knot behind her ribs she hadn't fully noticed carrying. Nothing in the tower asked to be understood all at once. Everything simply waited, patient as the light through the gear-shaped windows, for her to notice it in her own unhurried time. And she found she didn't mind the not knowing nearly as much as she might have. Back in the ordinary world she'd left behind on the misty road. Eventually, the catwalk curved downward, spiraling toward a narrower stretch of stairs than the grand staircase she'd climbed the night before. These steps were worn in the center, smoothed by countless unhurried feet, and the railing here was cooler brass rather than warm wood, as though this part of the tower kept a slightly different temperament than the rooms above. Here the ticking grew softer rather than louder, muffled, as though the tower itself were lowering its voice the further down she went. The air cooled slightly, not unpleasantly, carrying a faint scent she couldn't quite place, something like beeswax, and something like the inside of an old book left closed for years. And beneath both, something sweeter and harder to name, almost like the smell of rain before it falls, At the bottom of the narrow stairs stood a door unlike any she'd passed so far. It was smaller than the others, arched, made of a wood so dark it looked almost black in the low light, and set into its center was a single round window of amber glass, warm and glowing faintly from within, though no lamp was visible on either side of it. Around the frame, carved so shallow she had to tilt her head to see it properly, ran a pattern of small spirals, each one slightly different from the last, like 100 tiny watches wound to 100 different hours. Wren stood before it for a long moment, listening. Beneath the door, that deeper hush she'd noticed the night before pooled thick and slow, less a sound than a pressure, gentle against her chest the way standing near still water sometimes feels. It didn't frighten her. If anything, it drew her closer. The way the 3-note chime had drawn her from her own front door, out along the misty road, all the way here. She thought of Aurelio's note. Wander as you like, nothing minds. She lifted her hand and rested her palm flat against the dark wood, feeling faintly the same warm hum she'd felt in the banister the night before, patient, alive in its own quiet fashion, entirely unhurried. The amber glass at the door's center brightened by a fraction, as though it had noticed her hand and approved. There was no lock that she could see, no latch demanding to be worked. Only the door itself, waiting the way everything in this tower seemed to wait, not for permission exactly, but for readiness, for the particular moment when a person's own curiosity finally outweighed their hesitation. Behind her, distant now, she could still hear the faint, overlapping breath of the pendulum room, and further still, the higher, brighter ticking of the tower's upper floors, layered together into something almost like a lullaby hummed by a very large, very patient throat. She thought briefly of Aurelio, somewhere above her in the golden light, winding his small watch and listening for its single tick, unhurried as ever, trusting her to find her own way to wherever she needed to be. Wren took one slow breath, feeling the cool air settle in her chest, and let her hand find the door's edge. The door opened without resistance, swinging inward on hinges that made no sound at all, and the room beyond it took Wren's breath so gently she barely noticed it leaving. It was larger than she'd expected, circular, its curved walls rising into a domed ceiling of glass panes too high and too dim to see clearly, though faint starlight seemed to filter through them all the same. And everywhere, on shelves that spiraled upward along the walls, on small pedestals scattered across the floor, tucked into alcoves at every height a person might reach, or need a ladder for sat clocks. Hundreds of them, perhaps more than hundreds. They were not ticking. That was the first thing she understood, standing in the doorway with one hand still resting against the frame. Every clock in this room was still, hands frozen at whatever hour they'd chosen to stop. And yet each one glowed faintly, softly, from somewhere behind its face, an amber light that pulsed at long, slow intervals, brightening and dimming like something breathing in its sleep. As she stepped inside, The room didn't feel closed off so much as gathered close. The way a blanket gathers close around shoulders that have finally stopped shivering. The hush here was different from anywhere else in the tower. Not an absence of sound, but a fullness of it. Hundreds of silences layered together into something that pressed softly against her ears, the way warm water presses against skin. She walked slowly between the pedestals, careful not to touch anything yet, simply looking. Each clock was different. Some were small enough to fit in a palm, faces no bigger than a coin, cases carved from wood so pale it looked almost silver. Others stood as tall as she did, housed in cabinets of dark polished walnut, their pendulums hanging motionless behind glass. Some had no visible numbers at all, only soft markings like the ones she'd seen etched into the gears on the stairs. Water-worn, patient, unhurried patterns that seemed to mean something without needing to spell it out. She paused before one clock, small and round, its case the color of a robin's egg, its glow a shade softer than its neighbors. Something in its stillness felt less like sleep and more like listening, as though it were waiting for a particular sound before it would consider ticking again. "They're beautiful," she said aloud to no one, and found she meant it entirely, in a way that surprised her a little. The way true things sometimes surprise a person by finally being spoken out loud. The light from each clock brightened just slightly as she passed, not dramatically, not enough to startle her, but enough that she noticed and slowed her steps even further out of some instinct. She didn't examine too closely. It felt like walking past a row of sleeping animals who stirred faintly, pleasantly, at the presence of someone gentle. She wandered deeper into the room, past a cluster of tall case clocks arranged like old friends at a quiet gathering, past a low table where dozens of pocket watches lay nestled together in a shallow velvet-lined drawer, their chains tangled softly like a nest. One shelf held nothing but small hourglasses, sand long since settled into two even mounds, top and bottom, neither waiting to fall nor mourning that it never would. Another held a row of sundials, far too small to ever catch real sunlight, their shadows cast instead by the same soft amber glow that lit everything else in the room, as though the light itself had agreed to stand in for a sun that wasn't needed here. Above her, the domed glass ceiling seemed to hold the same starlight she'd have expected outside, though when she tried to place which direction the tower actually faced, the thought slipped away from her easily, without insisting on being caught. She let it go without much resistance. Some questions she was beginning to understand simply weren't meant to be answered on a first visit, and there seemed little point forcing one that clearly preferred to wait near the room's far curve, tucked into an alcove lower than most. She noticed a scattering of clocks arranged not by size or shape, but by some other logic she couldn't name, grouped closely, almost tenderly, the way one might arrange photographs of family on a mantel. She crouched slightly to look closer, and the nearest of them brightened her attention, its glow deepening from amber toward something almost gold. She didn't touch it. Not yet. She only looked, letting the fullness of the room settle over her slowly. This strange collection of stillness and soft light. Hundreds of hours that had each, somehow, decided to stop and stay stopped, kept safe here in the quiet dark, beneath the tower's endless, gentle ticking. Somewhere near the center of the room, she found a wide stone basin empty, its inner surface etched with the same spiral pattern from the door outside. Dozens of small circles nested one inside the next. She couldn't guess its purpose and didn't try very hard. It simply seemed to belong here, the way a hearth belongs in a room built for warmth, waiting patiently for whatever it was meant to hold. Whatever this place was, she understood without needing the words for it yet. It was not a room of things that had ended. It felt instead like a room of things that had simply decided they were finished being hurried and had chosen at last to rest. And standing among them, surrounded by that slow amber breathing, Wren felt something in her own chest loosen further still, as though her body recognized the feeling of rest even before her mind had caught up to naming it. You found the room then. Aurelio's voice arrived softly from the doorway, unhurried as ever, and Wren turned to find him leaning there with one shoulder against the dark wood frame, as though he'd been standing there a while without minding the weight. His watch chain caught the amber light, and for a moment the small brass watch itself seemed to glow faintly in sympathy door didn't seem to want to stop me. It rarely does for the ones who are meant to see it. He stepped inside, his footsteps making no more sound on the stone floor than the hush already settled there. I told you it wasn't going anywhere. I didn't expect you'd need quite so little time to come looking. I wasn't looking for it exactly. It felt more like it was looking for me. Something in his expression softened further at that, though it had already been soft to begin with. That's usually closer to the truth of it, he said. Come. Since you're here, I may as well tell you properly what this room keeps, rather than let you wonder all evening. He moved slowly among the pedestals, and Wren fell into step beside him, matching his unhurried pace without deciding to. Every clock in this room stopped itself, he said. Not broke, not wound down from neglect. Stopped deliberately, the way a person might close their eyes at the end of a very good day, satisfied, with nothing left unfinished. He paused beside a tall case clock, its pendulum frozen mid-swing behind aged glass, and rested 2 fingers briefly against its wood, the way one might rest a hand on the shoulder of an old friend. Each one stopped at its kindest moment, its calmest, the single instant when whatever it was measuring felt, for once, entirely at peace. Oh, whatever it was measuring, Wren repeated slowly. You mean someone's peace, a person's, something like that, yes. He continued walking, and his sentence, as it often did, trailed toward a low hum before he caught it again. The tower listens, in its way, the same way it noticed your tea before you'd asked for it. when it finds a moment worth keeping, a breath held gently rather than anxiously, a heartbeat slowed rather than raced, a mind finally quiet after a long time of not being. It gathers it, keeps it safe here, so that moment is never worn away by all the ordinary hours that come after it. Wren studied the tall case clock beside him, its pendulum caught mid-swing, and tried to imagine what kind of moment might belong to it. A quiet room somewhere, perhaps, or a hand held gently, or simply a breath let out after a long stretch of holding it in. The clock's glow pulsed slowly as she watched, brightening and softening in a rhythm that felt almost like it was listening back. That sounds almost like grief, Wren said, though she didn't feel any grief looking around the glowing room. Keeping something because it's already gone. Does it feel like grief to you, standing here? She considered the question honestly. The way the whole tower seemed to invite honesty rather than performance. No, she admitted. It feels more like being tucked in, like someone put a blanket over something precious so it wouldn't get cold. Then trust that feeling over the word you reached for first, Aurelio said. And there was something almost fond in the way he said it, patient in a manner that assumed she'd get there eventually, and hadn't rushed her only because rushing had never once helped anyone find anything true. The moments in this room aren't gone. They're only resting. The people they belong to are still out there, living the rest of their hours same as anyone. This room simply makes certain that one particular hour, the kindest one, never has to be spent again, to be remembered. Wren looked slowly around the room at the hundreds of soft, glowing faces, the tall case clocks, and the small robin's egg, one, and the drawer of tangled pocket watches, and felt the strangeness of the place settle, finally, into something gentler than strangeness. Not a mystery to be solved, a kindness to be witnessed. Do the people know, she asked, that a moment of theirs is kept here? Rarely while it's happening, Aurelio said. How could they? A person rarely notices their own kindest moment while they're inside it. That's often what makes it kindest, in fact. No self-watching, no performing peace for anyone, not even themselves. Only the plain, unguarded truth of feeling, briefly, entirely safe. He tilted his head slightly toward the ceiling, where the faint starlight filtered through glass too high to reach. Sometimes, much later, they find their way here anyway. The tower has its ways of calling people home to what already belongs to them, same as it called you tonight. How does it choose? She asked. Which moments to keep? Aurelio's gaze moved toward the far alcove, the one where clocks sat clustered close together, like family photographs on a mantle. And something in his expression suggested he already knew, with quiet certainty, exactly where this particular conversation was leading her next. Wren felt something quicken faintly in her chest at that. Not fear, but the particular alertness of a question she hadn't quite let herself ask yet. Home to what already belongs to them, she repeated softly. Perhaps, he said, it would be easier to show you than to explain it. Aurelio led her toward the far alcove without hurrying. The way he did everything. And Wren followed with her pulse, ticking a little quicker than the room's soft, ambient rhythm, though not unpleasantly. Whatever nervousness stirred in her felt more like anticipation than fear. The particular flutter of standing at the edge of something she couldn't yet name, but somehow already trusted. The alcove held perhaps a dozen clocks, arranged close together the way she'd noticed before, as though placed there by someone who'd handled each one with care. Most were small. A few were plain, unadorned wood or simple brass. Nothing like the grand cabinets elsewhere in the room. It was, she thought, a humble little gathering compared to the room's grander corners. And yet something about its humility made it feel more intimate than anywhere else she'd stood so far. This alcove keeps moments that arrived only recently, Aurelio explained, his voice dropping slightly, not from secrecy, but from the same instinct that makes a person lower their voice near something sleeping. Within the last handful of years, as such things are measured, the glow hasn't settled into its full color yet. It takes time, the way a bruise takes time to fade, or a scar takes time to soften into skin. He moved along the row slowly, naming nothing, pointing at nothing, simply letting his presence rest near each clock the way a caretaker might pause near each bed in a quiet ward, checking without checking, present without intruding. Wren watched him do this and understood without being told that this was itself part of his keeping, not the winding of gears or the tending of flame, but this, simply noticing gently that each small stopped hour was still there, still safe, still resting. Wren studied the little cluster, and her attention snagged almost immediately on one clock tucked slightly behind the others. Small, round, its case a soft, weathered green. Its glow dimmer than its neighbors, more silver than gold, like moonlight rather than lamplight. She couldn't have explained why it caught her eye over all the rest. It simply did, the way a single voice in a crowded room sometimes reaches a person before they understand why. That one, she said, before she'd quite decided to speak. Aurelio didn't answer right away. He looked at the clock she'd indicated, then at her, with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not surprise, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The quiet recognition of a thing arriving precisely when it was meant to. Go on, he said gently. You don't have to, but you can if you'd like. Wren stepped closer, crouching slightly to bring herself level with the small green clock. Up close, its glow pulsed slower than the others around it. Unhurried even by this room's already unhurried standards, as though it had been waiting a long while for exactly this moment, and had learned over that waiting a particular kind of patience. Its face held no numbers at all, only a plain, smooth surface the color of old silver, faintly fogged, the way a window fogs on a cold morning. I don't understand why this one, she said quietly, more to herself than to him. I've never seen it before. I don't even know what it's keeping. Don't you? Aurelio's voice stayed soft without pressing. Sit with it a moment before you decide that. Some knowing arrives slowly, the same way sleep does, You don't force it. You only stop resisting it. Wren lowered herself further until she knelt on the cool stone floor before the little clock. Her face nearly level with its fogged silver surface. Something about its glow felt less like light reflecting outward and more like light waiting to be let in. A door standing slightly ajar rather than a lamp simply burning. The stone beneath her knees held the same faint warmth as everything else in the tower, patient and unbothered, as if it too understood that she needed a moment before she was ready to go any further. Behind her, Aurelio had gone quiet in the particular way he seemed to reserve for moments that didn't need his voice added to them. She could hear him still, the small tick of his own watch as he turned it once between his fingers, out of habit rather than necessity. But he offered nothing further, letting the silence belong entirely to her and the small green clock kneeling together in the amber hush. She thought of the chime that had called her here, the 3 soft notes she'd chased her whole life without once finding their source. She thought of how certain she'd felt standing at the tower's gate the night before, that she had arrived somewhere she was allowed to stop. And she thought, kneeling here now before this one small, dimly glowing clock among 100 others, that perhaps those 2 things, the chime and this, had never been separate questions at all. "May I touch it?" she asked. "You may," Aurelio said, gently, though everything in this room prefers gentleness regardless. Wren lifted one hand, slow and careful, and let her palm hover just above the clock's fogged silver face, close enough to feel its faint warmth rising to meet her skin like breath. The towers ticking all around them seemed to soften further still, as though even the hundreds of other clocks had leaned in slightly, curious in their own patient way, to see what she would find. The moment her palm settled against the fogged glass, the silver mist across its surface began to clear slowly, the way breath clears from a window when a warm hand is pressed flat against it and held there patiently. Wren watched, hardly breathing herself, as the clock's face resolved into something she could see rather than merely sense. It wasn't numbers. It wasn't hands marking an hour. It was a scene, small and soft-edged, glowing faintly gold from somewhere behind the glass, like a memory viewed through the wrong end of a telescope, distant and tender all at once. She saw a garden, a hammock strung between two low trees, its rope faded from red to a soft, dusty pink. A girl lay in it, no older than 7 or 8, one arm trailing off the edge, fingers just brushing the grass below. Bees moved in slow, lazy arcs nearby, their hum a steady golden thread beneath the quiet. The sunlight fell through the leaves in shifting coins of light across the girl's face, and her eyes were closed, and her whole small body had gone utterly loose and unguarded. The particular slackness of a child who has forgotten entirely that there is anything in the world to be careful about. Wren's breath caught. She knew that garden. She knew that hammock, its faded rope, the particular particular slant of afternoon light through those specific leaves. She had not thought of that afternoon in years, decades, if she was honest. So long that she'd have sworn moments ago that the memory had been lost entirely, worn away by all the ordinary hours that came stacked on top of it since. That's me," she whispered. "Yes," Aurelio said quietly behind her. I didn't know I still had this. I didn't know it was anywhere. It was here," he said. "The tower found it a long while ago. Some moments travel further and take longer to arrive than others. Yours took its time, but it never once stopped moving toward you." She studied the scene a moment longer. The particular tilt of the child's head, the small crease of contentment at the corner of her closed eyes, a detail so specific and so entirely her own that no imagining could have supplied it after the fact. This was not a comfort invented for her. This was a true thing, kept safe, waiting. Wren stared into the small golden scene, at the child she had been, entirely safe in that hammock, entirely unwatched by worry, and felt something in her chest give way, not painfully, but the way a held breath finally lets go once a person realizes, at last, that the danger they'd been holding it against was never actually in the room. Tears rose, unhurried, and she let them, because nothing in this tower had ever once asked her not to. "The chime," she said slowly, understanding arriving the way Aurelio had promised it would, gently, without force. The 3 notes. I've heard it my whole life, in half dreams, in the middle of hard nights, was it? This clock reaching for you, he confirmed. The way water reaches for the lowest point in a landscape, patient and certain, never doubting it will eventually arrive. It's been calling you home to this for longer than either of us could easily count. You simply followed it a little sooner tonight than most nights. Wren looked back at the small hammock, at the closed, peaceful eyes of the child she'd once been, and felt something settle inside her that she hadn't known was still unsettled. A small ache she'd carried so long it had stopped announcing itself as an ache at all, simply becoming part of the general weight she moved through the world with. It eased now, not vanishing entirely, but softening the way a stiff joint softens under warm water. I forgot this happened, she said. I forgot I ever felt this safe. You didn't forget, Aurelio said gently. You only set it down somewhere you couldn't easily reach for a while. That happens to almost everyone, sooner or later. It's why this room exists at all, so that nothing kind is ever truly lost, only misplaced, waiting patiently to be found again, exactly when it's needed. Wren pressed her palm more fully against the glass, and the golden scene brightened by a fraction. The bees' lazy hum rising almost audible now. The child's chest rising and falling in slow, untroubled breaths. She stayed there a long while, kneeling on the warm stone floor, simply watching herself rest, letting the sight of that safety settle into her, the way warmth settles into hands held too long over a low fire. Slowly, thoroughly, reaching parts of her she hadn't realized had gone cold. At last, she drew her hand back, gently, the way one might withdraw from a sleeping child without waking them. And the mist crept slowly back across the glass, softening the golden scene back into quiet silver fog. The clock's glow didn't dim, though. If anything, it seemed to burn a shade steadier than before, as though it, too, had been waiting a long time to be seen properly, and could rest a little easier now that it had been. Aurelio waited beside her without hurrying her away. His own watch chain still and quiet against his coat. When he finally spoke again, his voice was softer than she'd yet heard it, gentle in the particular way reserved for moments too tender to risk disturbing. You can visit her whenever you need to, he said. The clock isn't going anywhere, and neither is she. That's rather the point of this whole room. If you'll allow an old keeper his small pride in it. Wren let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting years to be released, and something like a smile, small and unpracticed, found its way onto her face. "Thank you," she said to him, and then, quieter still, to the small sleeping girl behind the glass. "Thank you for waiting for me." "Thank you," Wren said, to the clock, to the room, to Aurelio, to no one and everyone all at once. She wasn't entirely sure who or what deserved the gratitude, only that it needed somewhere to go, and saying it aloud seemed the simplest way to let it land. Aurelio crouched beside her, slow and easy in his joints, the way a man moves who has never once needed to hurry anywhere in his long keeping of this tower. He didn't touch the clock. he only looked at it with her, the two of them kneeling together before the small green case with its steady silver glow. And for a while neither of them said anything at all. "Oh, does it stay here?" Wren asked eventually. "Now that I've seen it, if you'd like it to." He turned his own watch once between his fingers, listened to its single tick, and tucked it away again. Some people, once they've found their kept moment, choose to carry a small piece of it with them back into the world, a sketch, a written memory. Sometimes only the feeling itself held close. Others prefer to leave it here safe and simply visit when they need reminding. There's no correct choice, only the one that suits you. What do most people choose? Most people choose both in the end, without quite meaning to, he said. They leave the clock here, and yet somehow the feeling travels with them anyway. A little lighter for having been witnessed properly at least once. I don't think the two choices are as separate as they first appear. Wren considered the small hammock behind the fogged glass, the child she had been, so entirely at ease in her own skin and her own afternoon. "I think," she said slowly, "I'd like to leave it here. Not because I want to forget it again, because I like knowing it's being kept somewhere safer than I've managed to keep it myself so far. That's a wise instinct," Aurelio said, and something in his tone suggested he'd heard this same choice in one form or another many times before, and had never once found it wanting. You can always come back. The tower remembers its own, the same way it remembered you tonight. He rose, unhurried, and offered a hand to help her up, which she took steadier on her feet than she had in longer than she cared to measure. Around them, the room's hundreds of soft, glowing clocks pulsed on in their long, slow rhythm, patient as ever, entirely unbothered by the quiet exchange that had just passed among them. "Come," Aurelio said. "It's time you finished resting properly, rather than only halfway. The room upstairs is waiting, and so, I think, is the rest of your sleep." They climbed back through the tower together, retracing the narrow stairs. The catwalk, with its gear-shaped windows now dimmed toward whatever hour passed for evening, in a place that kept its own slow time. The wide staircase, with its warm banister humming faintly beneath her palm, the pendulum room breathed its slow, overlapping rhythm as they passed, and Wren found herself pausing just briefly at its threshold, watching the same green brass pendulum she'd noticed earlier still swinging its long, unhurried arc, and felt, this time, no ache beneath her ribs at all, only a quiet, easy fondness, the way one might glance fondly at a familiar room on the way to bed. The ticking, layered and soft, seemed gentler now than it had even the night before, as though the tower itself had exhaled, satisfied. Now that one more small piece of its keeping had found its rightful place. When they reached the round little room with its window seat and its quilt the color of a seashell, Aurelio paused at the threshold, the same as he had the first time. The tea things had been set out again, unasked, the cup already steaming faintly, and the quilt had been turned back at one corner There's no clock in this tower that will rush you, least of all the one that finally has you back. Will I still hear it? Wren asked. The chime, now that I know where it comes from. Perhaps, he said, though I suspect it won't need to call quite so far or quite so often, now that you've found your way to it. Some things only chime as loudly as the distance requires. Once the distance closes, they're often content to go quiet, satisfied simply knowing they've been heard at last. He left the door open its familiar small width, and his footsteps faded down the passage, humming softly as they went. The sound folding easily into the tower's own endless, gentle ticking, until Wren could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. She sat a while on the window seat, cup warm between her palms, watching the same low moon she'd watched the night before, though it seemed somehow a shade more familiar now, as though the tower had quietly moved it a little closer overnight, or as though she had simply grown a little more capable of receiving its light without flinching from it. Either explanation seemed equally likely, and she found she didn't need to choose between them tonight. Wren finished her tea slowly, savoring the last warmth of it, and set the cup aside on the small table beside the window seat. Outside, the mist over the hillside had thinned further still. Soft silver threads drifting apart to reveal the moon sitting fuller and closer than she remembered it looking the night before, as though it too had settled into something steadier now that the evening had done its quiet work. A few stars showed faintly through the last of the haze, scattered and unhurried, in no particular pattern she could name, though she found she didn't mind the not naming. The way she'd stopped minding so many small, unanswered things since she'd first stepped through the tower's brass gate. She drew the seashell-colored quilt over her legs and let her back sink into the cushions, feeling the last small tension leave her shoulders in a long, unhurried release, like a held note finally allowed to fade. Her hands, which had carried so much for so long without her quite noticing the weight, lay open and loose atop the quilt now, palms soft, fingers uncurled, the way a child's hands rest when nothing in the world has yet asked them to hold on tightly. Somewhere below, faint and steady, she could still sense the tower's layered hush of clocks, hundreds of soft tickings woven together into something closer to breathing than sound. And beneath all of it, fainter than ever now, the deeper stillness of the room of stopped clocks, where one small green clock glowed a little steadier tonight than it had glowed in a very long while. She thought of the garden, the hammock, the bees drifting lazy circles through warm gold light. She let the memory rest gently against her closed eyes rather than reaching for it, the way one lets a familiar hand simply hold one's own without needing to grip it tightly to keep it there. She thought, too, of the misty road that had brought her here, of how uncertain her steps had felt following a sound she couldn't name toward a place she couldn't have described, and how none of that uncertainty seemed to matter now, dissolved quietly the way morning fog dissolves once the sun has finally decided to rise. unhurried, in its own good time. She thought of Aurelio's small brass watch, wound once each evening for no reason but its own quiet ritual, and found herself hoping drowsily that wherever he was right now in the tower's slow golden dark, he was resting too, in whatever way keepers of towers allowed themselves to rest. The 3-note chime came once more from somewhere far below, or perhaps from nowhere at all. So soft now, it felt less like a sound and more like a memory of a sound content at last, to simply exist rather than call out. Wren smiled faintly, eyes already closing, and did not chase it. There was nothing left to chase. It had found her, and she had found it, and both of them, for now, were exactly where they were meant to be, no longer stretched thin across the distance that had separated them for so many years of half-remembered nights. Aurelio's footsteps had long since faded into the tower's quiet, though somewhere in that fading she thought she caught, one last time, the small single tick of his watch, wound and released, unhurried as ever. A tiny punctuation mark at the end of a day that had asked nothing of her but rest. She imagined him somewhere below, perhaps, standing quietly among the tall case clocks, checking without checking that all the tower's small kept hours were exactly where they ought to be, patient, gentle, endlessly unbothered by anything so small as time. The lamp beside her dimmed itself the rest of the way, gradual and unnoticed, until only the moon's soft silver light remained, pooling across the quilt and the worn stone floor, and the curve of the window seat where Wren now lay, breath slowing, body loosening fully into the cushions beneath her. Outside, the hillside slept beneath its thinning mist, dark trees standing patient along its ridge like old sentinels who had long since stopped needing to keep watch for anything more urgent than the slow turning of the seasons. Inside, the tower's hundreds of clocks kept their hundreds of gentle hours, none of them hurrying, none of them minding the other's pace, each one simply present, simply patient, simply kept. Somewhere among the tall case clocks and the small robin's egg, one, and the drawer of tangled pocket watches, the room breathed on in its slow amber rhythm, entirely unbothered by the passing of whatever hour the world outside might have called this. And somewhere below, in a room glowing soft and amber in the dark, a small green clock that had waited so long to be seen settled at last into a steadier light than it had held in years, not because anything had ended, but because something precious had finally, fully been allowed to rest. Wren's breathing slowed further, evened, deepened. The last of her thoughts unspooled gently, without urgency, the way a ribbon loosens from a hand that has simply forgotten to hold on so tightly. She slept there in the tower outside of ordinary time, wrapped in warmth and moonlight, and the soft, endless ticking of 100 small kept hours, all of them tonight, keeping watch so that she would not have to. Her breath grew long and even matching ever noticing the tower's own patient rhythm, until it was difficult to say which had begun keeping time with which, though the chime did not sound again. It didn't need to, as she was already home.